Good morning again, or good afternoon, depending on where you are all living, and welcome to the Middle East Peace Now April Forum. This issue of the excuse me, let me start over. We would like to, before I begin and introduce Ilan, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event: Jewish Voice for Peace, Twin Cities; Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel; Women Against Military Madness; and Eastside Freedom Library. We greatly appreciate all of these organizations and others in their support of Middle East Peace Now monthly forums. Please consider supporting these organizations by attending their excellent events as well. And before we begin our forum, many of you who live in the Twin Cities knew Chuck Lutz, who is a steadfast supporter of Middle East Peace Now, as well as other organizations that deal with Palestinian rights. Chuck passed away a couple of weeks ago at the age of 90, and his funeral will take place on April 30th at Lutheran Church of Christ the Redeemer in Minneapolis. Chuck will be greatly missed by our community, and I would be remiss in not bringing this up to all of you. Also, in February, MEPN featured the making of the film Boycott during that forum. We are pleased to announce that through the efforts of MEPN and others, this film will be shown during the Twin Cities Film Festival, May 18th and 19th. We're very excited about this. We encourage all of you who live in the Twin Cities to attend one of these showings. A link to the film festival with details will be posted in our chat. And now I'm going to turn it over to Maddie, who will go over our typical housekeeping items. Maddie?
Thank you, Janet. Yes, so just to cover some administrative notes for our forum, all participants will be muted for the duration of the event. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll put them in the queue. Please use the chat feature for any administrative or help questions, and also to find links for various events, as Janet mentioned, and we will do our best to assist you. Please be respectful in the chat and Q&A. We do reserve the right to remove anyone who is causing harm. And if Zoom is not working for you, please email mepn@mepn.org, and we will do our best to help. This event will be recorded, is being recorded, and will be available on MEPN's YouTube channel in the coming week. And for those of you who are attending our forum for the first time, special welcome to you. And we do email the recording link and other subsequent materials that have been brought up in the forum in a follow-up email within the coming week of this forum. So thank you all.
Thank you, Maddie. And now I would like to introduce our esteemed guest, Ilan Pappé. Historian, social activist, and Israeli iconoclast, Ilan Pappé was born 6 years after Israel's 1948 so-called War of Independence. After being condemned by the Knesset in 2007 and asked to resign his position as lecturer at the University of Haifa, Dr. Pappé left for the United Kingdom. He is now a professor in the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter. Ilan continues to write, speak, and teach. I'm sure many of you have read at least one, if not more, of his books. His book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, is considered one of the foremost publications of the truth behind the 1947-48 war and beyond colonization of Palestine by Israelis. Please give Ilan Pappé a warm Zoom welcome. Ilan?
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Janet, and thank you for the organizers for having me. And thank you all for attending this meeting. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. I will talk today about decolonization as a concept which is relevant for Israel and Palestine. And what I will do in about half an hour that I will take from your time is, first of all, explain what I understand by the term decolonization. Then I will talk about how this concept is now used by activists and scholars who work for and about Palestine. And then finally try and translate it into a certain political program for the future, that is put forward by an initiative that I'm part of, the One Democratic State campaign, that is trying to disseminate the discourse on the one-state solution and galvanize support for it as the only possible and alternative solution for the future. Decolonization is associated, quite rightly, with a specific historical period when the great empires collapsed and were dismantled. These were processes that allowed ethnic, cultural, and religious groups to demand nation states in the name of self-determination. While in Europe, this process referred to the creation of nation states, in Africa and South America in particular, decolonization was described as the replacement of colonial rule with post-colonial movements of liberation. However, with the appearance of critical works on the post-colonial period, and with the realization that colonization can take different form long after empires collapse and physical occupation ends, quite a few scholars have come to appreciate that decolonization has not yet been completed. Decolonization has thus become a popular and significant topic in academia and in activism, informing the production of knowledge and engaging with the colonialist and post-colonialist periods, focusing on European settler projects from the 17th century until the second half of the 20th century. Decolonization also re-emerged as a clear political program for social movements in places where the former empire are still controlling crucial aspects of life and remains a potent idea, especially in settler colonial settings. This was and still is the discourse that accompanies the struggles of indigenous people in Mexico, the First Nations in Australia and Canada, and the Native Americans in the United States. As an actual physical process on the ground, decolonization of settler colonial state has occurred recently in two places in the last part of the 20th century, Algeria and South Africa. These two historical developments energized studies on decolonization and helped scholars to identify settler colonialism, not just as a historical phenomenon, but also as one that is still a relevant paradigm for analyzing the situation in many parts of the world today. Recently, a number of scholars have framed the Zionist movement as a settler colonial movement and Israel as a settler colonial state. From this perspective, Israel as a settler colonial state is a project that could, in theory, still be decolonized. There is still a wide gap between this emerging and growing literature, which offers alternative visions for a decolonized future, and the hegemonic academic and public discourse on Israel and Palestine, which frames the conflict as one fought between two legitimate national movements, or as an issue confined to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip since 1967. Until now, therefore, mainstream academia, media, and the politicians involved in the so-called peace process regarded decolonization as a plan for the future rather than as a possible scholarly framing of the conflict as a whole. Indeed, until the 1980s, decolonization as a concept was absent from the academic discourse on Israel and Palestine. In that sense, the balance of power on the ground was also reflected in the production of knowledge about the region. More recently, decolonization as a possible solution has entered the discourse about peace in Palestine, and the depiction of post-mandatory Palestine as a settler colonial reality has moved from the scholarly margins of academia into a more central place in knowledge production sites such as universities and research centers and think tanks. And so often, as often happens in the case of Palestine, ideological positions and scholarly stances have intermixed and fertilized each other. The decolonization of scholarly knowledge about Palestine's history began in the late 1960s by way of interpreting the Palestinian struggle as anti-colonial and recently by analyzing Zionism in Israel as a settler colonial phenomenon. By now, numerous PhD students outside of Israel have employed the settler colonial paradigm to analyze the modern history of Israel and Palestine. Many of these graduate students are also activists, and therefore their work engages with efforts to bring about decolonization as much as they are interested in analyzing the reality on the ground. Political sociologists find it difficult to assess the influence and significance of young Palestinians or pro-Palestinian intellectuals within Palestinian society as a whole. Needless to say, they have no impact on Israeli Jewish society. But recent developments are noteworthy. What can tentatively be concluded so far is that even if this scholarly and activist effort does not yet impact national Palestinian politics from above, or the position of the leadership, it certainly has a potential to do so in the future. There are two reasons for this prediction, maybe three ones. The first one is that I'm an optimist by nature, but the two other ones are more serious. The dialogue among Palestinian scholars and between them and interested scholars worldwide is much more feasible now in an age of accessible and ever-expanding cyberspace, where once there were physical barriers that prevented such connections, now cyberspace allows Palestinians to spread and interact with new ideas and to strive to have wider influence than ever before. In a society that is very young, and I will repeat this fact later on, the Palestinian society between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea and in the refugee camps is one of the youngest in the world. These ideas are spreading with extraordinary speed, making it difficult for us to fully assess their impact. The second possible trigger for such a development in the future, namely the possibility that decolonization would dominate our discussion on Palestine and inform our plans and ideas for moving forward, is the resurfacing of the discourse of the one-state solution that at least in part perceives Zionism as a settler colonial movement, Israel as an apartheid settler state, and decolonization as the precondition for peace and reconciliation. Shireen Hussein, in her excellent survey on the one-state conversation, insisted that the one state is only a discourse and not yet a political movement on the ground, though her book does not cover the development in the last 5 years. In Gramscian terms, what she describes is a counter-hegemonic discourse that follows what Franz Fanon predicted would be a decolonization process. You first decolonize the colonized mind before you can decolonize the colony itself. It can thus be said that decolonization is a common term among activists and an appropriate academic one for describing the way forward towards reconciliation in historical Palestine. But some questions are still hard to answer. What are the chances that such a discourse will inform the policies of the future political elites and powers that be? Does this discourse have a realistic chance of changing reality on the ground? Will this conflation of activism and scholarship be able to impact Palestinian political discourse, given that all the official Palestinian representatives, Palestinian Knesset members, Palestinian Authority, the PLO, the Hamas, endorse the two-state solution? Moreover, decolonization as a proper term is also absent from the vocabulary employed by members of the international community elite working to find a solution for the Palestine issue. And there are only a handful of anti-Zionist activists in Israel who converse, in this language. However, there is a Palestinian consensus about the nature of the struggle, even if the end game, namely whether it should be a struggle for a two-state or one-state solution, is under debate. They don't debate the way. The struggle, unlike the desired solution, is framed as a stubborn, at times even bloody and violent journey that has become a way of life since the arrival of Zionism in Palestine. The interplay between the hope for any peace agreement and the intensity of the struggle by whatever means against Israel is an important factor that affects not only the reality on the ground, but also the conversation over alternative solutions. The absence of such hope for a peace in diplomatic process has propelled this conversation forward and produced the new vocabulary. This vocabulary replaces the concept of peace with decolonization, the term reconciliation with regime change, occupation with colonization, and the Nakba with ethnic cleansing, among other entries. This new dictionary of vocabulary is now employed extensively by young scholars writing on settler colonialism in Palestine, but not only by them. It is becoming an acceptable prism through which Palestinians and their supporters all over the world view the future. Recently, some of its entries, so to speak, have been inserted into the discourse employed by journalists, pundits, and politicians engaged with the question of Israel and Palestine. And recently, it was also adopted by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem. The spillover of this new vocabulary and the discourse of decolonization into more mainstream venues is caused by 5 discrete processes, as I will outline in a minute. Should these processes continue and intensify, this new language and vocabulary will grow more acceptable and may even become predominant. The first process is the incremental delegitimization of the current Palestinian representative bodies. There were already demonstrations against, as you are all aware of, against both the PA and the Hamas in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And even the standing and the status of the leadership of the Palestinians in Israel, despite a short period of working together in the joint list between 2015 and 2019, is under serious challenge by the Palestinian community in Israel itself. And this is the reason why such a large number of Palestinian citizens of Israel boycotted the April 2019 elections. These were just few instances that we can count in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and inside Israel of the crisis of confidence and representation in Palestinian politics, probably dating all the way back to the destruction of the PLO base in Lebanon in 1982. The traumatic event then had disempowered the already fragmented Palestinian national leadership. Although the PLO survived until 1988 as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, the emergence of political Islamic groups, and even more so the Oslo Accords, eroded the legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership in many quarters of the Palestinian society, wherever these people live. This void in Palestinian politics is ripe terrain for the growth of new ideas and for the evolution of a new discourse. In the case of Palestine, quite often such a void is an opportunity for the revival of old ideas and their adaptation to present realities. And indeed, even among PA leaders and Palestinian politicians in Israel, more and more voices are now heard calling for a one-state solution. It's true that in the case of the official PA representative, the one-state option is framed as a threat to the liberals in Israel and the West, in the sense that if the two-state solution fails, Israel would have to become a non-democratic apartheid state encompassing the entire territory of historical Palestine. But for others, the one-state solution has remained the preferred model. In either case, if it unfolds as a reality, the new dictionary might become more relevant. If indeed a consensus develops that the two-state solution is dead, then the very notion of decolonization will no longer seem so alien, even to the pragmatic politicians of the West and various Palestinian groups. This observation is further supported by a second recent development, the shift to the right in Israeli politics. This shift has been accompanied by intensive Judaization of the West Bank and by the other discriminatory policies toward the Palestinian communities on both sides of the Green Line, creating de facto one non-democratic state. The legal and actual status of Palestinians in Israel is still superior to those who live in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. And there are differences between the conditions of those living in the West Bank, between those dwelling in area A, B, or C, respectively. Within a one-state solution envisaged by the right wing in Israel, the annexation of the West Bank, in particular of area C, 60% of the West Bank, will create a greater Israel with two small Bantustan, one consisting of the remaining 40% of the West Bank and one of the Gaza Strip. The areas C with Israel would be governed by the same legal and constitutional system. The main challenge against which the Zionist left is warning is the dramatic increase in the number of Palestinians who would become Israeli citizens in such a case. This is why the new system, in order to maintain the Jewish nature of the state, would be equally discriminatory and racist towards the Palestinians wherever they are in this new enlarged Israel, so as to ensure that they have no impact, as now the West Bankers have no impact, or the people in Gaza have no impact on the state's identity, ideology, and strategy. Political activism in Israel on the Palestine question has been focused until now on the question of whether to withdraw from the 1967 occupation. This dichotomy could change now as a result of the new focus on a one-state solution and generate a public debate on the nature of this future single state that at present is well on the way of becoming a pure apartheid state, if it is not already one. The third process is on the other side of the political divide in Israel, namely the disappearance of the Zionist left, or the liberal Zionists, a process that already began 20 years ago. Seen from within the paradigm of decolonization, and for that matter of settler colonialism, the Zionist left is what Albert Memmi has called the leftist colonizer. These are settlers who remain within the ideological framework of colonialism, or in our case, within the framework of settler colonialism. And in the words of Albert Memmi, either willingly or reluctantly are still, in his word, part of the oppressing group and will be forced to share its destiny. And he adds, even if the leftist colonialist is in no way guilty as an individual, he shares a collective responsibility by the fact of membership in a national oppressor group. The leftist colonizers, namely the liberal Zionists, are more susceptible to believing that international law does not challenge their ideology. More specifically, they believe that it does not challenge the privileges granted to them by the settler colonial state, and that an improved settler colonial state could be created in conformity with international law or human rights or civil rights, thereby leading to necessary changes on the ground. In the April 2019 elections, the number of anti-Zionist members in the Knesset was the same as those of the left Zionist parties, the Labour Party and Meretz. And in the September 2019 elections, they had two members of Knesset, the anti-Zionists had two members of Knesset more than the left or liberal Zionist parties. It seems that the Israeli electorate is not attracted to leftist colonizers. This constituency had been not most loyal to the two-state solution and to the basic principles forming the so-called peace process. Recognizing that this is very little Jewish electoral support for the two-state solution might open the way to a different framing, at least among the left Zionist politicians, who might follow the path of someone like Avraham Burg, who did a journey from a two-state to one-state solution. Burg is a veteran politician, the son of the famously almost internal Minister of Interior, Yosef Burg, who also led the Religious National Party from the early years of statehood until the early 1980s. Avraham Burg veered more to the left, joined the Labour Party, was elected Speaker of the Knesset, and subsequently served as the chairman of the Jewish Agency. In this century, after a short stint in the business world, he returned to politics, accepting a very critical view towards Zionism and supporting the one-state solution. The fourth process, which is also intertwined with the previous three, is the decline of the peace process, the Pax Americana, a peace process produced by America, managed by America, and envisaged by America, that had been attempted ever since 1967. The peace accord initially signed in 1993 was never pronounced officially dead, although it is very clear that in 2000 already it had petered out and disappeared. The final nail in the coffin of that peace process was the election of President Donald Trump in 2016. As can be seen from our vantage point, his administration and the Biden administration are both eager to withdraw from any potential role in the peace process on the one hand, and they endorse Trump more openly, Biden more indirectly, officially and unofficially, but definitely unconditionally, Israel's unilateral actions on the ground on the other. Trump's decision to recognize Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, which the Biden administration accepts, further diminished any hope for a two-state solution as the Americans' position, also included in the infamous deal of the century. This new American stance undermines the role of international law as the legal infrastructure for future solution. Without such an infrastructure, the two-state solution has nothing to offer to either side. Finally, it's noteworthy that the Palestinians are one of the youngest societies in the world, as I've already commented. The United Nations Population Fund already noted, in fact, in 2015, when it stated, and I quote, Palestine is facing a period of rapid population growth and a large youthful population with 70% below the age of 29, unquote. This young generation's operating mode is different in many ways from that of the elders, as can be seen in the various levels and through discrete actions and projects that so far have not been translated into a meaningful transformative movement, but may do so in the future. And we might see it in the coming days this month, in April 2022. One mode of action has been the return march, known as the Great March, conducted along the borders of the Gaza Strip, which began in March 2018. This was the initiative of a young group of Palestinians such as Ahmad Abu Arisma, who represents the these new young Palestinian activists in the outside world, well-educated and highly committed. He and others have organized weekly demonstrations of thousands and at times tens of thousands of people along the Gaza border. The aim was twofold. The first was to attract world attention through courageous protests, resulting quite often at a high casualty count, against the long Israeli siege of the Gaza Strip. As the United Nations report has pointed out, the siege might render life in the Strip in coming years unsustainable. The second demand was to return to the villages and the lands from which they and their families had been expelled in 1948, located on the other side of the fence. From this perspective, the right of return is not for refugees, the right of return, is not just an imaginary vision, especially not for the refugees in the Gaza Strip, if a single democratic state were to be the solution. This is why the approximately 350,000 internal Palestinian refugees living in Israel as Israeli citizens, namely those who were expelled in 1948 from their villages and towns, but remained within the Jewish state, and their descendants, who are organized in an NGO, some of you may know, called the Association for the Defense of the Rights of the Internally Displaced Palestinians, are supporting the one-state solution. In other words, although the Palestinian refugee community, estimated 5.5 million, is scattered all over the world, those in geographical proximity to Israel and dwelling in refugee camps deem such a scenario, a decolonized process that leads to one-state solution, to be an endgame of their struggle. Palestinians of a similar age, as well as a fair number of young progressive Israeli Jews, demonstrate quite regularly in solidarity with the demonstrators in Gaza that has stopped due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but might be reintroduced. And now the focus, as you know, has moved to Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, with a similar kind of young solidarity all over historical Palestine and beyond. This kind of solidarity, these kind of actions and commitment are part of a larger conversation carried out by the younger generation of activists and scholars. They communicate easily and across borders and are networking among the various Palestinian communities around the globe. The dialogues and communication can be seen as a new stage in the Palestinian political and cultural resistance to Zionism. They exchange projects of oral history about the Nakba, as well as models of reconstructed villages destroyed in 1948, and building future models of future villages to be built after the return of Palestinian refugees into historical Palestine. Whereas the fragmentation of the previous generation was the product of hard borders, fences, and regional conflict, this generation does not need at this stage to meet physically in order to form a joint agenda and vision. This discourse among digitally interconnected young Palestinians across the globe has not yet contributed to the emergence of an effective social movement. Efforts to do so have suffered from the lack of any significant institutional infrastructure, a deficiency that similarly undermined the more hopeful moment of the so-called Arab Spring. This younger generation is very skeptical about institutions, which have been deemed corrupt and ineffective. However, transformations of this magnitude will be impossible if the youth ignore existing institutions or do not build new ones. In March 2018, I was part of the One Democratic State campaign, aimed at creating a joint space for individuals and movement already acting on behalf of the idea. The wish in this program is to enhance a dialogue on the one-state solution and to locate the disagreements and the challenges ahead. It differs somewhat from similar attempts in the past, as it taps into a rich body of academic work that has been done on the topic in the last decade, and thus focuses more clearly on translating what could rightly be described as a utopia into a more practical program through, for instance, social movement theories. The One Democratic State campaign has a document, a constitution, and I would like in my final 5 minutes or so, concentrating on this campaign as a practical representation of how everything I talked about until now, the discourse of decolonization that leads to the discourse of one state, becomes a political program in the eyes of many Palestinians and progressive Israelis who are willing to be part of that movement. The preamble of the One Democratic State campaign, which I and others helped to write, states the following. Let me read this very shortly. In recent years, the idea of a democratic state as the best political solution for Palestine has re-emerged and gained support in the public domain. It is not a new idea. The Palestinian liberation movement before the Nakba of 48 and after had promoted this vision in the PLO's national charter, abandoning it for the two-state solution only in 1988, although through the years there were indications that the PLO is willing both to give up the demand in the charter that all the Jews who came before 48 would leave, and that it is possible to establish a Palestinian state in the 1967 occupied territories as a first stage on the way to full liberation. It was on this basis that in September 1993, the Palestinians entered into the Oslo negotiations. The two-state solution was also endorsed by all the Palestinian parties represented in the Israeli Knesset. But on the ground, Israel strengthened its colonial control, fragmenting the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip into tiny, isolated, and impoverished cantons, separated from one another by settlements, massive Israeli highways, hundreds of checkpoints, the apartheid wall, military bases, and fences. After a half-century of relentless Judaization, the two-state solution must be pronounced dead, buried under the colonial enterprise on the territory that would have become the Palestinian state. In its place, Israel has imposed a single regime of repression from the Mediterranean Sea and to the Jordan River. End of quote. The main point in this opening paragraph is to accentuate the need for a Palestinian-led initiative that is based on the recognition of the Palestinian movement as a legitimate anti-colonial movement. In other words, this preamble uses decolonization or the decolonization discourse explicitly. The program appeared in Arabic, English, and Hebrew. It has sections that would be very difficult for the Israeli Jewish constituency to swallow, and some that Palestinians would find hard to accept. Thus, for instance, I realized how alien the following section in the program would sound to Israeli Jews, and I'm reading. The only way forward to a genuine and viable political settlement is to dismantle the colonial apartheid regime that has been imposed over historical Palestine. replacing it with a new political system based on full civil equality, implementation of the Palestinian refugees' right of return, and the building of a system that addresses the historic wrongs committed on the Palestinian people by the Zionist movement. End of quote. The main bone of contention here is indeed the promise to guarantee the right of return. However, this new approach is entirely based on transforming the hegemonic Zionist discourse and re-education, maybe even unlearning as much as is possible, the privileged section of this unjust system by reframing past and present realities. Even in the case of South Africa, this kind of transformation, decolonizing the colonizer's mind, was not a precondition for decolonization. South Africa didn't wait for every white person to reject apartheid, but it occurred on a significant scale only after decolonization came about. Yet it seems that in the South African case, and hopefully in the case of Israel, there was a need for only a small group of the colonizers, the oppressors, to subscribe to the new framing that, in addition to other discrete processes, caused the transformation on the ground. Thus, in South Africa, it was the decision of the United States to join the sanctions regime after the Cold War, and that was a prime factor bringing down the apartheid regime. The other two factors were the steadfastness of the jailed African National Congress leaders and the liberation campaign. This campaign, by the way, that the times were quite violent, motivated a small number of whites to join the ANC. The multi-ethnic ANC convinced the more pragmatic members of the regime that the apartheid system had to be dismantled. Only subsequently did large sections of the white society acclimatize to the new reality in South Africa. How to make the insistence on implementing the Palestinian right of return more palatable to Israeli Jews is one of the many projects that may benefit enormously from collaboration between scholars and activists. It is possible that the more detailed picture would soften resistance. In a recent book, Eitan Bronstein presented several surveys taken among the Jewish population, inquiring about their position on the right of return. It shows a clear increase in the consent among Jewish citizens in Israel to the right of return, around 30% of those sampled. Salman Abu Sitta's work, for its part, shows the possibilities of implementing the right of return without dislocating anyone in Israel. Palestinians will find it difficult to accept any section in the program of the One Democratic State campaign that refers to the collective rights, and especially the national rights of the Jews in the joint state. Let me read shortly what it says there. We, Palestinians and Israeli Jews alike, have therefore revived the one-state idea. Although possible different models range from binational to liberal, secular, and democratic state, we are united in our commitment to the establishment of a single democratic state in all of historical Palestine. Now, those involved in authoring the program hoped that the following way of articulating the national rights of the Jewish community in a one-state, always a thorny issue in the eyes of many Palestinians, would help to allay Palestinian apprehensions. I quote, "This constitution will also protect collective rights and the freedom of association, whether national, ethnic or religious, class or gender-based. Constitutional guarantees will ensure that all languages, arts and culture can flourish and develop freely. No group or collectivity will have any privileges, nor will any group, party or collective have the ability to leverage any control or domination over others. Parliament will not have the authority to enact any laws that discriminate against any community under the Constitution." Thus, the collective and national or ethnic identity of the original settler community can be maintained, that is the Israeli Jewish identity, but not on the basis of a privileged structure. This is closely connected to the question of future Jewish immigration, which is privileged and exclusive in the present regime of Israel. The program calls for a neutral policy of immigration, exempting the right of return. The program states that the normal procedures of obtaining citizenship will be extended to those willing to immigrate to the country. I suspect this balance between Jewish immigration and Palestinian return will undergo several rounds of revision if ever this program, or one similar to it, will be seriously considered politically. Although it would be a huge challenge for the Zionist Jews to give up the law of return and accept the right of return of the Palestinians, it is very difficult to see how Palestinians would be willing to equate preferential immigration status to Jews around the world with the right of the people who were expelled to return. The future of such initiative depends much on its ability to be sold as a practical, not as a utopian political program. The translation of the program into a practical way forward can be done in the future by academics and activists. There are today a large number of postgraduate programs focusing on Palestine in the world, and quite a few of doctoral dissertations produced there already cover the practical aspects of statehood. Some areas have not as yet been researched by scholars, such as the future constitution and the educational curricula of one state. Other topics can be examined, such as the mechanism of restitutive justice, the issue of compensation return, and so forth. Let me conclude. In December 2018, the Israeli Knesset passed the nationality law, which recognized only one nation within the undefined borders of the State of Israel. The law introduces two terms. One is the State of Israel, Medinat Israel, and the other one is the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. The latter refers to all the territory west of the River Jordan, that is Eretz Israel. The law declares that the state regards the development of Jewish settlement, Hityashvut, a national value, and would act towards expanding and consolidating it. Although it does not specify where these Jewish settlements projects would be expanded and consolidated, the law clearly implies that this would occur in the West Bank. Thus, in essence, the law is committed to expanding the state of Israel into the land of Israel. Both this law and Benjamin Netanyahu's commitment on the eve of the April 2019 elections to officially annex parts of the West Bank are indicators of the institutionalization of the one non-democratic state over the whole of historical Palestine. These developments continue what Oren Iftach El recently termed as incremental apartheid. This is a valid analysis that describes the institutionalization of the apartheid state that can only be challenged through decolonization and not through partition. As the Bantustan, the South African autonomous kingdoms established by the apartheid regime, did not serve as a proper alternative for apartheid South Africa. In the near future, the process of incremental apartheid will be accelerated by governmental legislation and policies on the ground benefiting from ineffective global condemnation. And don't be misled by the present government of Israel. In this term, it doesn't offer anything different from the Netanyahu governments in the past and probably the one that we will have in the future. In the field of knowledge production, we will quite surely see the further application of the settler colonial paradigm to the Palestine case, along with more active and younger scholarship on Palestine taking the form of cultural and political resistance. Antonio Gramsci remarked once that cultural resistance is either the substitute for political action by the feeble party or a grand rehearsal for political resistance. Time will tell which of the two definitions is relevant to this case. Finally, let me make two remarks about the future. First, it is noteworthy that decolonization cannot be a project of the colonizer, but that of the colonized. For decades, the so-called peace process was made up exclusively of Israeli initiatives. Decolonization is first and foremost a Palestinian initiative, which has not been attempted for a while. Secondly, decolonization can also be carried out from below. The hallmark of settler colonialism on the ground is segregation, whose antithesis is desegregation. This has recently happened on a small scale in towns that were built exclusively for Jews, but are now binational, enjoin schools operating despite a segregated educational system, and adjoin workplaces and shopping malls. The imbalance of power is still evident in these locations, but it enhances a desegregated culture that can be transformed into a decolonized one in the future. And thank you for your patience and time.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. There's a lot packed in 35 minutes or so. We'll move to the Q&A. And We have many of them, so I will start with the ones that came in through the registration. Could you please make a few comments about Amnesty International's recent report, Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's very important to understand in what way the Amnesty report differs from other references already made by B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch and by scholars to Israel as an apartheid state. The first difference is that Amnesty International has a different standing than the other organization. It is respected as an unbiased human rights organization that has this mode of action that it doesn't allow people from the areas it inquires about to be part of the investigation. So these are people who come from the outside, and what they see with their own eyes leads them to make these unbiased and professional judgment. Secondly, there is a whole section in the Amnesty International report that refers to the academic work, namely what Amnesty International recognizes and what I think Human Rights Watch failed to recognize, and also B'Tselem failed to recognize, was the shift of framing Israel as an apartheid state, framing the Nakba as an ethnic cleansing, framing Zionism as a racist ideology. The shift from making all these framing, the shift from making them as a political position into making them into valid academic scholarly judgment of the reality. Namely, if I say that Zionist ideology is racist, it's not a political position only. It is based on a profound and serious academic research. If I refer to Israel today as an apartheid state, it's based not only on my moral position, my intuitive observation, it is based on serious scholarly work that examined whether Israel can be or cannot be defined as an apartheid state. And so I think in this respect, and I know there are some Palestinian criticism on the Amnesty International report, I think this is very important. Time will tell, of course, how much this small step would change the discourse among the political elites of the West, because we haven't yet transformed their attitude towards Palestine. But I see it as a small step, but a very significant one toward changing the conversation on Palestine.
And thank you, Ilan. And I would add to that, having read The Biggest Prison on Earth recently, your academic approach to the subject also lends itself far more credibility than an emotional response. Not to dismiss emotional responses, because they're also important. Thank you. The next question. Those of us who defend Palestinians are often accused of anti-Semitism. As true anti-Semitism is on the rise, how best to respond?
Yes, this is, of course, a problem we all face. Even if we are Jews like myself, we are accused of being self-hating Jews. I think that there are two things I always suggest by dealing with these allegations, or the way that the Israeli propaganda and its supporters are weaponizing anti-Semitism in order to silence criticism of Israel and advocating for a genuine liberation in historical Palestine. The first one is that not to cave into this tactics of intimidation and join the conversation is if this is a realistic conversation. In other words, the question is not whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. The question is whether Zionism is racism. And I think we should make the effort of distinguishing between the two conversations. There has to be an important conversation about anti-Semitism, definitely. But there is also a very important conversation about racism, which is not only directed against Jews because they are Jews, it's directed against Muslim because they are Muslim, it's directed against African Americans because they are Black, and it's directed against Black people and non-white people all around the world, and it's directed against Palestinians because they are Palestinians. These are two different discussions and conversations, and any attempt to conflate them as one conversation is only meant to exclude one group of racists out of this conversation and protect it by claiming that it itself is victim of racism, which might be true, but it doesn't mean that the ideology they subscribe to is not racist. The second point I would make about this, that no soundbite can easily confront and deal with a sentence which says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, or criticism of Israel is Holocaust denial, and so on. You cannot, unfortunately, answer it by a soundbite. So you have to insist on time, on space. You need time to explain why Zionism is ideology and Judaism is religion, why anti-Zionism is anti-racism, and why Zionism has very strong racist components in it. You cannot do it with sound bites. If people are not willing to listen and learn and sometimes unlearn, what can you do? But it always reminds me, I go as much as I can to an annual march to one of the destroyed Palestinian villages inside Israel every year. And I'm quite familiar to some people, and Israeli Jews who on the same days usually celebrate the Day of Independence stop me in a juncture before the lights turn from red to green. And they always kind of say to me, how can you subscribe to these horrible views? How can you support this cause? And my answer is always, do you have time? Because it's an important question. Coffee is on me. Are you willing to sit with me for an hour? I'm willing to explain to you. I cannot through the window explain to you. Of course, in most cases, they don't come to the invitation. But we need to insist on time on this because there is a certain complex explanation to be done here. But this is not the conversation we should be involved in.
Thank you. I think our representative Ilhan Omar might borrow some of your words. She has met a lot of resistance, as you know. Before I continue with the third question, I want to make sure that I insert this. Someone has said, and certainly we all echo this, please express an enthusiastic appreciation for this incredible lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, third question. How do you gauge potential success of BDS? I know you are a supporter of BDS compared to other, quote, strategies, if any, for achieving a, quote, fully just Israeli-Palestinian solution.
I think the best way to answer is to focus on what I see as the three major efforts we outside of Palestine, who are part of the solidarity movement with the Palestinians, can focus on. And one of them is definitely the BDS, and maybe in that respect, I could answer both parts of that question. One major effort, which we are doing, but we don't have enough tangible success, but it doesn't mean we won't have such a success in the future, is to translate what is obviously a genuine, widespread support for the Palestine cause in civil societies around the world that is not reflected in policies from above, by governments, political elites, mainstream media, mainstream academia. How do we make sure that even in democratic societies, a democratically majority opinion in support of Palestine becomes something that forces our representatives to represent us democratically when it comes to Palestine? They refuse to do it. They don't do it in the United Kingdom. They don't do it in the EU. They don't do it in the United States and Canada. They don't do it in South America. They don't do it in the Arab world recently as well. So we have to find a way to translate it. The second one is, of course, the important work done by the BDS by galvanizing activists, giving them a proactive role by representing in a very clear way the limits and borders in which activism can be more effective in solidarity with the Palestinians, regardless of what happens in the Palestinian national movements, the ideological factionalism, and so on. So I think that it is an important process that can always be done more. More can be done. I still think, with regard to the two major efforts, and I will come in a moment to the third effort, with the two major efforts, without evading the answer, the question, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that an activist, it's always the question how to gauge and to assess the success. I think as an activist, you always have to assess whether your effort was enough, not whether your success was enough. Because history teaches me as an historian that the most successful activists did not live to see the success of their activism. Now, I'm not predicting that all of you will not see the success. I'm sure you will. But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to concentrate on, did we do enough, rather than what have we achieved so far. The balance of power on the ground is so terrible. So the imbalance, I'm sorry, is so big. The destructive nature of the Israeli policies is so horrific. Then of course, it's difficult to see transformation happening on the ground. And we will have to wait and see. But I think we know enough of where we should continue with the efforts of boycott, sanctions, and divestment in that case, rather than kind of assessing. And finally, very shortly, the last effort is the one I did in this lecture. I think it's very important to change the conversation on Palestine through education, through academia, through media, not letting the hegemonic conversation that is now dominating, for example, the coverage over the Ukraine, to go amiss in the way that it would never have used in the case of Palestine. We should use these horrific, terrible situation in the Ukraine, for instance, to remind the world that when Palestinian high-rises were blown up, when thousands of Palestinian citizens were killed, the world did not even allow mainstream media to cover these atrocities, let alone giving it even 10% of the emotional and moral coverage that the Ukrainians are benefiting from in the Western media. We should be aware of these issues, point to the hypocrisy, to the double standards, and make sure that people understand what the Palestinians have been suffering and going through in more than a century, in the last 100 years and so.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I would add to that, when you mentioned media, social media, and I'm going to give a shout out to our own Facebook page, which has been gaining more and more viewers. So we make a great effort to post recent events that people need to know about, that the mainstream media will not cover or will cover on page 12. The next question, would you briefly summarize your, quote, 4 lessons from your recent article on Ukraine and Israel? He or she cannot remember the title, and give any update if applicable since you wrote that article.
Oh my God, I'm not sure I remember all the 4. So forgive me.
How about 3?
I'm getting older, I don't remember, but so let me summarize them rather than as 4 points as in one, also for the sake of time and making sure that there's time to answer some other questions. Basically, I looked at few issues there. One, I was, like many of you, I'm sure, kind of bewildered at the way Europe dealt with European refugees and compared to how it dealt with Arab refugees and African refugees. The difference in the coverage, the language, and the actual support given was striking, as if the non-European refugees are of a different creed and do not deserve the same reception and absorption that is afforded to the Ukrainian refugees. The second one kind of lessons was to make sure that we navigate properly between an understandable human solidarity with anyone who is being bombed expelled, God forbidden, loses relatives and friends in an act of violence. We navigate between that natural human reaction and our ability as a thinking human being of understanding the context in which things are being done. In this connection, I just highlighted the fact that the Ukrainian nationalism, which President Zelensky represents very well, is a very right-wing nationalist, Central European kind of nationalism. Even if he's a Jew, he's very much connected to neo-Nazi groups in the Ukraine who, like all the right-wing Central European national parties, like in Hungary and Bulgaria and elsewhere, are great supporters of Israel. Zelensky supported openly the Israeli destruction of the Gaza Strip in 2021. We should remember that. Yes. He took out the Ukraine from the committee for protecting the inalienable rights of the Palestinian refugees. Nobody justifies what Putin is doing, and this is not the way forward, no, for sure. But let's not forget that some of these national movements at the center of Europe, who have a terrible record as collaborators of the Nazis in the Second World War, are still very much allies of Zionism because of their anti-Semitism, not because they have any respect for human rights and civil rights. And finally, of course, this whole idea that you can not afford to Palestine, as I said before, even a modicum of the coverage, the sympathy, the empathy that you are affording to the Ukrainian is a double talk and double standards that should be highlighted and challenged very strongly where is possible.
Absolutely. I'm going to skip down to some of the questions that have been posed during the forum. This one's an easy one, looking at the time. Ilan, is it all right if we go past 11:15 our time?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you.
Maybe put the lights on. I think it's getting dark.
Yeah, you're getting dark there.
Okay. So I'm turning the video, but I'm listening to you for a second.
All right. What is the book you mentioned about decolonization?
Oh, God. That was quick. I mentioned few sources on decolonization. I mentioned Albert Memmi's book on the colonized and the colonizer. But any work by Albert Memmi is very, very important. And there are other books to be read by Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, very interesting thinkers that viewed very closely decolonization in North Africa and taught us important lessons, not just about decolonization, but about the oxymorons that so many of us, even I in my sins in part of my political career, thought were possible, that you can be a progressive colonizer, that you can be an enlightened ethnic cleanser, that you can have a liberal apartheid state. All these oxymorons for a very long time were accepted by large sections of the Western society, as if it's possible to be such impossible person or institution or movement. We are now reaching a point in history where people understand you can either be a colonized society or a decolonized society. There's nothing in between. And to my mind, the two-state solution perpetuates colonization, and we need to find an alternative way, because without decolonization, not only Palestinians, of course, will continue to live under oppression, colonization. I think it's also very bad for Israelis and Jews to continue to live in such a reality.
Absolutely. Ilan, perhaps tomorrow or sometime when you have a moment, can you just jot down some of those authors and books for me? And we'll, we'll follow up in an email. Thank you. All right, the next question. The UN has recognized apartheid as a crime, but as far as I know, colonization is not an international crime. If we are working to decolonize Palestine, what can we point to in international law to support this position?
Well, it's not entirely correct. It's very interesting. International law after the Second World War, absolutely, in its famous Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, did not include colonialism as a violation of human rights and civil rights, because the countries that supported the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, most of them were still colonialist empires themselves. In 1960, colonialism was entered into the body of contracts that dealt with international law as a violation of human rights, colonialism. But Canada, the United States, Australia, and South Africa at the time made sure that settler colonialism, unlike colonialism, would not be considered a violation of human rights and civil rights. How did they do it? They said that colonialism is only when a country creates a colony over the ocean. So you cannot create a colony inside the United States or inside Palestine and so on. Namely, they wanted to protect settler colonial states from international law. So you're right, international law until today cannot deal with Zionism as an ideology. It can definitely use human rights international law to condemn Israel for the apartheid wall, for violations of political prisoners, the demolition of houses, and this is very important. So we should continue to rely on international human rights law, but we should not for a moment think that international law would help us in decolonizing Palestine. The Palestinians have a very good concept that was used by the ANC actually in a different way, and it's called al-Shar'iyya al-Duwaliyya, the international legitimacy, not international law, international legitimacy. It's a fluid notion. It's not written in constitution and contracts, but it is a very strong global sense of what is right and what is wrong. And that sense was a helpful, it played an important part in bringing down apartheid in South Africa. And I think it will play an important part in the decolonization of Palestine. So international law might help to ease the oppression, but international legitimacy may bring justice and liberation.
Thank you. Next question. We have many.
It's okay.
I'm reading a book whose name is A Paragon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book.
No,
Recently, I got the impression that Palestinian labor is an important part of fulfilling ordinary needs of Israelis, that is construction, fixing repairs, etc. It makes me wonder of how dehumanization/humanization of Palestinians takes place when they see each other in proximity from your point of view.
Well, the phenomenon is wider. Of course, 50% of the medical institutions in Israel are run by Palestinians, from head of departments through the best surgeons in the country, nurses and medical staff. So it's not only construction, but it's also in the medical sense. But you know, racism, as probably you're familiar from other places in the world, a Palestinian doctor can save your life and you still use the life given to you to, advocate hatred against the Palestinians. Your personal experience is not enough, apparently, in order to change people's basic perceptions of reality and so on. But they might play a role, definitely. In that sense. But I think we have to be aware of two different processes we're talking about. And at the end of my talk, I talked about building from below a certain joint life through joint schools and other spaces where people live together, work together, and share together the daily experiences of life. This building from below of a joint life in an apartheid state is not enough to create a different reality. You really have to dismantle a colonialist institution and regime in order for that very basic positive human energy to live together to become the common reality. What we have now in Israel, of course, and over there are spaces where people live together, work together, share destiny together. But they are, first of all, opposed by the regime. And secondly, they are not enough to create a transformation because the institutional infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, the military and economic infrastructure, as well as the ideological one, is so powerful that they become meaningless in the life, meaningless for most of the people living between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, and of course, for the millions of refugees who are waiting to come back. But it's important to note these areas and strengthen them, of course, because they will be needed to be cores for building a joint life together once the other issues I mentioned would be resolved.
Thank you. Could you elaborate on how and by what processes a single state would uphold the rights of Palestinians in practice? For example, the US and other nations show democratic states still struggling and failing after 200 plus years to uphold and respect the human and civil rights of all groups, despite a supposed equality in law. I think I know I know what country she's referring to,
Yeah.
or he.
Yeah, listen, beginning decolonization is not the end of the process. We need to decolonize Britain. There are former subjects of the British Empire and citizens of Britain who are still suffering from colonialist racism in Britain today, not to mention the United States, Australia, and so on. But you know, these are struggles that will not be carried alone by the Palestinians. They will be carried by, I hope, an intersection of movements around the world that want to continue decolonization as the major fight against racism, which is still the most important base human attitude towards other human beings. But we have to start somewhere. And that always reminds me, you know, when you go to South Africa, activists try to kind of cool down your enthusiasm, and rightly so. They say to you, come on, economic apartheid is still continuing in South Africa. There's so many issues which have not been resolved in apartheid, in post-apartheid South Africa. And I say to them, yes, but I'm coming from Palestine. And the difference between the two of us is that you have reached a station where you found the right train in the right direction. The train has not reached its destination, I agree, but you are on the right train. In Palestine, we're still looking for the station, let alone the train. So we are willing to be in your station and have the problems in order to try and say, this is now our next assignment. So definitely, it would take a lot of energy, thinking, and common sense to build secure life for the colonized in a decolonized society, giving what you rightly say, whoever asked the questions about other realities. But we need to get to that point where these energies can be invested. Most of the world and some of the Palestinians have wasted 50 years in putting all their energies and thinking into the two-state solution, which was like the famous Jewish saying, you don't look for the key where there is light, which is the two-state solution. You look for the key where you lost it, which is the one-state solution. And we didn't do anything in many years about this. So I think that you're absolutely right to point to these challenges, but I think these are challenges of society as a whole, and we will be part of that challenge in the Arab world and beyond.
Thank you. From your view as a scholar and professor, could you briefly speak to the risks and challenges to students and young professors who engage in decolonization-related activism and scholarship? And how do you and other professors support students whose character and reputations are targeted as anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, I myself decided that the best way of doing it, but I can only cater for a small group of people, is to create a safe space for young scholars to work on decolonization in Palestine and beyond without fearing for their career and position. And that's when I founded in 2007 the European Center for Palestine Studies, and the first ever Palestine Studies program in the world that in many ways until today provides secure space for doing a PhD on decolonization in Palestine. I'm not trying to convince you to come and do a PhD with me or with my colleagues, but it's one of the safest spaces we have. I fully appreciate that these safe spaces are not everywhere. And I'm familiar with individual young scholars who are facing the threat of losing their career and position if they will engage of these topics, which we take for granted in my Center for Palestine Studies in Exeter. We try to support every individual who faces this, but not only myself. I think more and more professional associations such as MISA in the United States, such as Brismas in Britain, are now aware of these dangers, are trying to support. They're not always successful. We have some colleagues who lost their positions, are fully aware of it. It's a struggle that has to be continued. I always say to people, if you are in a vulnerable position, don't become a martyr. Try to navigate carefully and sensibly about this position. Never do it alone. Make sure that there is a network that supports you. And yes, you are going to be blessed with the famous the Chinese curse. You're going to have a very interesting life if you choose Palestine as your topic as an academic. Interesting meaning that you will probably be doing work on something that is close to your heart, but will bring to you challenges that normal young scholars would never face in their academic career. But it's a worthy struggle, but one that has to be done commonsensical, and most importantly, never do it alone. Try to be part of a network, and there are networks that support young scholars in such situation, give advice, learning from other case studies. And I know this is an issue we are facing, as some of our colleagues, as I said, lost their jobs, but we are fighting to reinstate them, and we are fighting to make sure that we can protect our colleagues in the future. It's definitely one of the battlefield for struggling for Palestine, undoubtedly.
Thank you. That question gives me hope that there must be at least one person in the audience that is a young scholar looking for this type of direction. I think we have time for one more question. We have more, but in the interest of time, we need to cut it off at some point. So to those who posed a question and it did not get addressed, I apologize. In the interest of time, we have to cut it somewhere. Can you comment about the right of return, how the right of return can be implemented without displacing anyone? And in conjunction, could you return to the question of right of return for Palestinians to paint a picture of how in practical terms that right might be implemented?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there are a few stages here. One is to recognize in principle the right of Palestinian to return. I think this should really be a sacred right. Before we act, we go over to the practical questions before it is translated into an actual program of return. Because you need a principled position on it. And I'll give just one short reason for it. The main reason Israelis and pro-Israeli Zionists negate the right of return is not practical. It's not practical, it's racist. They cannot at any given point foresee themselves living in a country that recognizes that 48 was an ethnic cleansing crime against humanity for which Israel has to do something in order to acknowledge and be accountable to. And secondly, they cannot envisage a country in which the Jews are not the majority for racist reasons, because they have these racist ideas of what happens if the Jews are not the majority and the Palestinians are the majority. They immediately talk about the second Holocaust, genocide, and all these other nonsense. So we need to adopt this ideological position on the right of return if we are anti-racists. and if we recognize the racist nature of Zionism. As for the practical, there is one way of dealing with it that Salman Abu Sitta, I mentioned it, and I will add him to the list that I promised Janet.
Thank you.
Salman Abu Sitta has a whole project and website in which he's a cartographer, among other things. And he shows to where Palestinians, in the case that all of them would like to return, would return to, and he shows that in very, very few cases will other people be dislocated because of this relocation of the refugees or their repatriation. Because you have to remember, in some places, especially in towns, in the houses from which Palestinians were expelled, other Palestinians are living there, not just Jews. So this is a question that definitely, there is one way of looking at it through Salman Abu Sitta's highly important work. But there are also the Pionero. I don't know if many of you are aware of the Pionero principle. Pionero was a United Nations official who in 2015 prepared a very important set of principles for repatriation, taking into account the fact that things are changing, the reality is changing in a place to which people are returning from exile and refugeehood. And these are very important principles that respect the dignity, the property, and the history of both those who were expelled and those who took over their properties and life. This is a very sensible and sensitive process by which you make sure that the rights of the returnees are done in a way that enables joint life together afterwards. I don't have time to go. It's a very long process and document, but don't be misled. There's no need to invent the wheel. There is no need to buy into the fact that practically it's impossible, that this would create another crime of dislocation. This is not true. If you imagine how much energy, resources, and science is invested in creating weapons of mass destruction, of creating political solution that has no validity or any connection to reality, imagine if even 10% of that human resources would be invested in finding a humane, sensible way of making sure that refugees can return and build joint life with the settler community that lived there now over 100 years. It's possible. It's a humane project that, if is allowed to take place, has a very good chance of succeeding without romanticizing the fact that it will have difficulties in the way and obstacles and opponents, but nonetheless is a worthy project to be invested in and be involved with.
Ilan, would you come back sometime and speak again?
Yes, I would be very happy when time allows to do that.
We'll make it a deal.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you so very much. So much to take in, and more to come, we hope. So we thank you, from all of us. Thank you. I'm looking at the chats, and everyone is extremely appreciative of your joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Just a couple of things. A reminder to complete the very short evaluation. The link has been posted in the chat. As always, today's forum is recorded and will be posted on our website. So if you have people who you think should be hearing this and watching it, please direct them to our website. Next month's forum will be May 21st, a Saturday, of course, via Zoom, and will feature novelist and activist Susan Abu Hawa, who's author of the Blue Between Sky and Water and many other Palestinian-based novels. She's a wonderful author, and we look forward to having her in May. And finally, if you are new to MEPN forums and like what you see and hear, please consider becoming a member. Our dues are a very reasonable $40. A link has been posted in the chat for you to give this way via givemin.org, or you may give directly by sending your check to MEPN. On behalf of the board, we thank you for your support, and we look forward to seeing you at future forums. And again, Ilan, a hearty thank you and warm.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon or evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.